This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Views on Vue. My name is Fritz from the Vue core team. And today on our panel, we have Erik Hanchett, software developer, author of Vue.js in Action.
Hey.
We also have Divya Sasidharan, Vue developer, speaker, and contributor.
Hello.
And today, our guest is Mitchell Garcia. Mitchell, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mitchell Garcia. I run the blog frontendsociety.com. We focus almost entirely on Vue.js, so that's my main thing, blogging.
Cool. And so how long have you been using Vue now?
I've been using Vue for about a year professionally. I've always been kind of, watching it in the background though.
What first turned you on to it?
To be honest, it was the single file components. That was one of the things that it definitely made sense to have everything in the same file, and Vue's implementation of doing it in a single file component was the easiest to learn and introduce, especially with a team of kind of full stack developers. It's easier to sell them as opposed to JSX and CSS in inline,
Yeah, they don't have to learn like a new paradigm.
Yeah.
Was the developers already using React? And did you have to move them over? Have they moved over to Vue in your professional workspace?
Yeah, where I'm at, OZRK Labs, we did Angular project to a Vue project. And that was a pretty effortless transition because a lot of the directives we used were the same exact thing. The only thing that you really had to learn was single file components. And even then, there's nothing to learn. It's just that you put everything in the same file. And there was nothing to learn, which is why we picked it.
Yeah, and so for those who might not know what single file components are, I mean, you talked about putting everything in the same file. What does that mean?
Yeah, the single file components. So there's the .vue files, they're also called. And basically, Vue has the Webpack loader, which will take a Vue file, which consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, all in the same file. So you don't have these .css files, you don't have .html, you don't have .js, you have a .vue file, which consists of all of those. And it'll take it and basically parse it into something that the browser understands, and it turns it into JavaScript. So it's a good way of separating things into components, because when you build it out in a single file component, you are thinking about your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript all within this isolated context, as opposed to as a separate file or even like a separate folder. It's all tightly coupled. It makes it much easier to write those tightly coupled components.
Okay. So playing devil's advocate for a moment, is that actually a good idea? Like, isn't that like the opposite of separation of concerns? Like, shouldn't we have our HTML all in one place, and then our CSS all in one place, and then our JavaScript all in one place?
Yeah, we should. No, the separation of concerns on the front end is different than separation of concerns in technology. When you separate concerns, you're separating what you're actually thinking about. So when you build a Vue component, that's a singular concern. What it consists of, whether that be CSS, HTML, or JavaScript, doesn't matter. So when you separate your HTML and your JavaScript, you're not separating concerns, you're separating technologies. They're very tightly coupled.
Okay. So we're integrating concerns that previously were like all over the place in our app.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And are there any other like advantages to single file components besides, just organization?
What can you do? So you can do custom blocks, which is something we actually do with my team at OZRK Labs. We have documentation in line with the component 2. They just introduced that, where you can specify a custom type of content. So it's not just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It can be docs. It can be internationalization content. It can be, literally anything. It's super flexible.
Cool.
How does that work?
With the docs or the custom blocks?
Yeah, the custom blocks. Can you expand on that a little bit? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, so you can specify in your Vue loader config whether or not you want a specific block to be parsed with a specific loader. So like for ours, we have open bracket, doc, close bracket, and then we write out the documentation. Then we close it out, kind of just how you do the template. And then in the Webpack config, we basically specify with anything in the doc tag, use this loader. And our loader will parse it out and add it to a markdown file that is included just in the README.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, super cool.
Awesome. Have you seen, besides documentation, you also mentioned internationalization. Have you seen other examples of custom blocks that you found really interesting?
Oh man, that's about it. And that's the main concern. Have you guys seen any? I haven't seen any in the wild yet. I just know it's possible.
I've seen some for unit tests.
Oh, yeah, so that actually makes a lot of sense.
Inside. No, I personally prefer to keep unit tests in a separate file, just because like unit tests can get so big.
Yeah, and it's super. They can get. Yeah, that's the same point you had where it's going to be larger than the actual component, and there's going to be a lot of context that you just don't really care about when you're working on the component.
Yeah. With the script and CSS and JavaScript, I'm often jumping between those, but I'm usually not jumping back and forth between the test and those other sections, except when I'm writing the test. Then I've written the test and then it's done.
Yeah, you don't flip through tests every now, just all the time.
Generally not necessary. Yeah, until expectations change.
Yeah.
And I think some of the blog posts that you've written, it seems like one of the things you really like about Vue is the component system and the modularity. And there was one post that you wrote about global registration with Vue.component. And I think you were arguing that people should not ever use global registration with Vue.component. Is that accurate, or is there more nuance there?
That is accurate. And that article accidentally got popular. And I think because people thought I was saying do not use components. And they got very excited because they were like, what's after components? What's next? But what I was saying is Vue offers a method called component where you can register a component basically globally so you can access it anywhere in the template. And to me, and you can see in the article, you can just search why you shouldn't use Vue component. You can read that. To me, that's just not really the best practice most of the time. I mean, like most things, never say never. I think 95% of the time, though, you should explicitly define dependency.
So what are some exceptions? When might it be okay to globally register a component?
I think it kind of just depends on the scale of what you're actually working on. So if, and that's my perspective too, like a lot of the work I'm doing is in super long-term financial products with teams of 6 to 10 people. So we are super, super anxious about the introduction of any global in the code base whatsoever, because there's no guarantee that you'll be working on that same project forever. Like so many people just working on so many different projects that you cycle through. So it depends on scale. So there's a difference between large scale data intensive internal application with 10 developers working on it and like a 2-person marketing website or something like a startup. If you're doing like a smaller scale startup website, the globals do make sense because they're very easy.
And so apart from scale, there are also different kinds of apps. Like sometimes you have a single so-called single-page application, where Vue is basically taking care of the entire front end. And sometimes it's integrated into, some kind of backend technology like Rails or Django or something like that, where you have templates that the backend takes care of. And then sometimes you just use Vue to add like little bits of special interactivity. So you'll drop in components, but otherwise you're writing normal HTML, and you're using whatever the templating engine that the backend server provides. In those cases, would you say that people shouldn't use Vue.component?
You know what? No, I would not say that. I would say that it only makes sense really to avoid using Vue component if Vue manages your entire website, where it is a single page app using Vue router, Vuex, and Vue, and it's interacting with the API and then updating the DOM that way as opposed to being rendered by a server. So yeah, that's a really good point, and that is a time when you should use Vue.component. Yeah. Got
it. And then you mentioned you make some exceptions in scale sometimes. So if it's, maybe a small team and a small app, maybe it's okay to use Vue.component. Are there other exceptions that you would make?
When should you use Vue component? Yeah, there is a front-end library. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's called a Vuefi. It's kind of like a wrapper for Bulma, which is a CSS library that's written in Vue. Huge fan. It's super good looking. It works really well. And in that code base, they actually use Vue component exclusively. They don't have any explicit module dependencies. So if you're using a library, I feel like it does make sense. Or if you're developing a library, I feel like it does make sense to use Vue.component.
To offer that as an option? If you want to just... you mean to offer that as an option where you just want all of the components in that UI library to be available in all components?
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of, because it should just be what the implementing developer actually wants, so like if you are fine with kind of doing the more plugin like approach where you include this in your project and you have access to these components and you don't really care about having a globally accessible component, then that should be offered. But you could also do exporting modules and then the implementing developer just imports what they actually need. You can do both, And then when you do the plugin approach, then you would use Vue component. If you export the modules, you just would export it like an object.
So what's the downside to just having everything globally registered? Then you don't have to import it and locally register it in every component. It seems like it would just save work, right? If you just globally registered everything?
It saves work, but you lose the developer ergonomics really of the explicit module dependencies. So
oh, what do you mean? What does this mean? The developer ergonomics? Isn't it more ergonomic if they have to do less work?
Well, you lose the developer ergonomics of being able to isolate where this component is coming from. So when you do the globals, you're saying, okay, so I have a B-loader component. Where does that come from? If I Control F through my project and I search for B-loader, oh, that doesn't exist. So now I look for B capital loader. Maybe they registered it with a different name. Oh, that also doesn't exist. So then you'll end up going into your index.js file and seeing, okay, maybe they installed a plugin to this, oh, they have Bulma or they have Vuefi. Okay, so it looks like Vuefi has B-loader component globally registered. I didn't know that, and I had to do some extra work to get that. And that's that only happens when you're not the only person working on a project. So when you open up a file and you're like, what is this? It helps to have those whatever you need explicitly defined.
Cool. And are there any other disadvantages that you would say? Any other reasons you wouldn't want to use Vue.component?
That's the core one. Just and that is pretty similar to a lot of other frameworks, how they're set up, where React, it's just a JavaScript module. So you import that when you want to use it exclusively. There is no global React. I'm not sure how Angular 1 does it globally to a fault, in my opinion. There's no option to register a component locally. And that it's much easier to think of Vue components to me as just objects as opposed to components, because when you pass an object in a Vue component as a requirement, so you know how you I do it in the article, but there's a components key in your Vue component where you can pass other Vue components that it relies on. So when you think about those as just plain objects, which is what they are, you can just specify plain object in that. You can just specify plain object in the object. It's much easier for me to kind of teach it, as opposed to saying here's this magical thing. When you say Vue component, you're going to be able to use it in the template. To me, whenever I'm telling someone about Vue, it's easier for me to say, all right, so if you want to show something in the template, you have to put it in this. If you want to show a component in the template, you have to add it to this key on the Vue component, and then it'll show it in the template.
Mm-hmm.
It's so it's just, to me, it's easier to teach it. And whenever I'm talking about Vue, I love talking about how all of the Vue components have the same exact structure. So whether it's a gigantic page or just a tiny little input, it's always going to have data, methods, whatever, components. It's all just an object at the end of the day. So it's easier to teach Vue that way if you just think about it as objects as opposed to components.
I will say one other advantage I know for local registration rather than global registration with Vue.component is that if you decide to programmatically register everything, then everything is guaranteed to be in your build. So if you stop using a component, it'll still be included in your Webpack build, even though it's not actually being used anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But if you remove the last place that you're importing it, then Webpack just won't use it. It'll look through all your files and it'll see this file isn't being used by any of the other files. So I'm not even going to include it in the final build. So you can accidentally sometimes end up with components that you're not using anymore, and maybe your team didn't even realize you weren't using anymore, or maybe you're just not using anymore for a while. Maybe you decided to keep it because I think we're going to bring it back in the next sprint, but we removed this from the interface for now. So that is another advantage. I think
it's also important to standardize which direction you take. So if you do Vue.component, if your entire app has both Vue.component and single file and globally and single file components that are locally registered, then it can get confusing because then you're not sure what exactly is global and what is local, which has happened to me multiple times where I would, on a project that I'm working on, we have a UI library in which we can standardize specific components. So if you have an input or a button and so on, and then you can just import, I use you can globally register it in the project. And so you have access to all of these components that you can build a form or whatever that you want to build. But then they are specific to the project, which are local. So it starts to get a bit dicey because you're starting to lose track. And going back to your point, and you don't know where things are because you're oh, it's weird because I'm using this component that's not actually being explicitly registered in the specific in that single file component. So it feels magical, and it's also a matter of the benefit of local registration is that you can trace to exactly where that component is being created, and then secondly, that also gives you access to figuring out what that component requires from a props perspective and what exactly returns the methods that are available. Because there's so many points where when I work on a globally registered component, there's button 1 and button 2 or various different primary and secondary, and I forget what exactly it takes in, like what props it takes in. And so like just from to think about and reason about, it's easy to like, so I think one way or another, it's good to be explicit and being like, okay, we're going to use Vue.component globally. And so now I know that because we're using Vue.component, I can go to like the UI library to check for that component versus.
Yeah, and with the tooling too, so Vetter, the VS Code plugin will give you autocomplete on those specific props if you do local registration for a component. I think that they're working on a way to do it with global components, but you would have to hard code it. Vetter, if you do it locally, it'll just pull it in, which we use like every single day. It's such a productivity boost. Yeah.
And I will also say there's another case when I like to use Vue.component. And this may sound controversial to you, but I actually like to use a mix of Vue.component and local component registration. And those
no.
And here's the reason. I like to programmatically require and register all of the base components in the app. So I usually use a base prefix. And these are like, base input, base button. These are wrappers for like the essential components in our app. I might have like a base modal. They're very generic. They usually don't have anything to do with the actual business logic of our app. It just happens to be how we want things in our app to work and look. And those are generally used like all over the place. And so there's very low risk of those, no longer being used. And then we don't realize they're not being used anymore. And then it stays in the build. So those I like to globally register, and then everything else I like to locally register. And that way, if people know, if it begins with base, you don't need to import it. And it's a simple role.
I mean, that still follows the standard, so I know what to expect. Versus just like randomly, locally, and globally registering stuff and then not knowing what's happening.
Yeah, as long as it's consistent, that's the takeaway.
Yeah, because I think the biggest pain too, like when people decide like, maybe we should just like globally register everything, it's always with those components that they're using all over the place. Like if it's a button, or let's say like it's a link, they have like a base link component. It's like, gosh, we're using links all over the place. Do I really have to import this everywhere I want to use it? It slows people down. And they don't have to like import an element when they want to use an element. So, we're basically allowing them to do the same thing that they would do if they were using the raw element.
Yeah, and that kind of makes it really similar to that of like a web component where you're not thinking about it in the context of Vue. It's just markup that is also tied to JavaScript. It's a custom tag. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense sometimes when you're consistent.
Yeah. I could see if you're like Chris, you're consistent and you have a folder, you're putting these global components in. I could see an issue once you get like dozens of them in there. And then at some point you may have an issue figuring out which ones you're still using, which ones you're not using, or if you have to refactor, changing things out.
Well, generally for any base components, they are very, very commonly used. That they're things that aren't specific to like a particular part of your app. They're specific to just like something you want to be able to do in your app, like have selects or have buttons.
This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the hosting provider I use for devchat.tv. I also use it for my applications that manage the RSS feeds, scheduling, and sponsorships involved in delivering these shows. DigitalOcean is easy to use, has data centers all over the world, and provides terrific services including server hosting and object storage for delivering your web applications and assets quickly and easily. I use DigitalOcean because I love their interface. I get SSD storage for my servers, and their support replies quickly. So go check them out at digitalocean.com.
I'd like to ask Mitchell more about his TypeScript work, because I know you've been writing a lot of blogs about TypeScript in Vue, and I think that's kind of really interesting. I know Vue 3 has it built in to select when you create a new project. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely, yeah. TypeScript and Vue is just now kind of getting a lot of support for it. There was, we did Vue and TypeScript about a year ago. We migrated our Angular app to Vue, and the Angular app was written in TypeScript. So we're just like, let's just keep the TypeScript. And at that point, there was really not a lot of ergonomics and tooling with it. Since then, there's been major improvements, specifically in Vuex. So I'm going to do a shout out to one of my favorite people on GitHub. I believe his name is KTSN. His picture is a small yellow cat. And he is doing a ton of work on Vuex and TypeScript. So in about as soon as 6 months ago, there were a bunch of these third-party libraries that basically wrapped your Vuex modules in TypeScript typing so that you can make those type safe, where you not only get IntelliSense, but also compile errors if you pass the wrong type as an argument. But the issue was that you had to write the code that connected the TypeScript to the JavaScript. So like it was a wrapper in the truest sense, where all it was doing was kind of returning a function in TypeScript that included all of these types. What KTSN's pull request is doing is it's allowing you to write out basically your store once in TypeScript. So you can say, these are the actions, here's what they expect. It needs a string, it needs a number, here's the getters, and here's the other thing. Here's your store basically in TypeScript. And then just writing it once, you basically can just keep on writing Vue and Vuex exactly how you would in JavaScript, just with the benefit of those TypeScript typings. And it's super, super clean, because it is exactly like the API that JavaScript provides. There's no wrappers, there's no extra code, it's just you write one TypeScript file and that's it.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Now, there is Vue class component too, but that is going away, and there's something Vue extend. So can you tell me the differences between those two as well?
Yeah, so Vue class component, are they still doing it? Is it discontinued? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think it's going on I'm not quite sure if they're
it's not actively maintained. That's what we built. That's what we built the app in. Initially, it was because then it's the same thing where it's basically a wrapper for the Vue API. So if you have like a React, if anyone has React experience, so all your React components are classes. This was basically the same thing, just in Vue, where you specify a component as a class, and then you would add a decorator, and that would add all the appropriate Vue stuff. So lately, and in the latest version of Vue, actually, I'm not even sure if it's the latest version. I think it's an older one. It's been a bit. I think it's version 2.5. They drastically improved the type inference, so you can actually just write your Vue components how you would in JavaScript, similar to how you would in Vuex, and you get all the type safety. So before, if you did Vue.extend in TypeScript, there was no way for TypeScript to infer that component's type because it didn't know what this was. You would do like this.foo equals bar. It doesn't know what this is at any point. In the newest version, it can infer whether this.foo exists and what it is based on what you provide in as a data property or a computed property or method or anything. It's just like writing Vue and JavaScript, except you get type safety, which is kind of the direction I hope they go in the future.
Yeah, everything I've seen on it looks pretty awesome. Yeah, it definitely. I'm looking forward to using it more in my own projects. I do a lot of Angular in my job, and doing that. Some of the benefits of TypeScript and Vue is really nice to have.
Yeah. Are you using a Vue class component?
No, we're not. No.
Okay.
All the work I've done with Vue, I haven't used TypeScript. It's something I'm looking to add in for sure, though, just because of all the niceness about it.
Yeah, we're not even getting that much benefit from the type safety, but I preach developer ergonomics, but just getting that autocomplete when you're typing stuff is honestly worth it to me. It does a number in making it easier to reason about other people's code.
Yeah, and a small note: you can get some of the autocomplete without actually even using TypeScript.
What?
Yeah. So because of the typings that Vue provides, and because of the work that's being done in Viter, we're trying to give you as much as possible. When I say we, I mean like people who are not me. Other people on the core team are working to provide a better experience for people using the TypeScript typings and using the tooling that's being built for TypeScript, even for people who aren't using TypeScript.
How does that work?
Oh, we look at the TypeScript typings, and we can in Viter can analyze the object that you're exporting in your .vue files, and give you some of the same kinds of warnings. We won't give you anything that it's not exactly like using TypeScript. You won't get compiler warnings or anything like that TypeScript would give you.
Mm-hmm.
But even for props and stuff like that, I believe Viter is working on, and this is really kind of separate from TypeScript, but has to do with types. When you're about to type something, showing you a little message about whether this expects a string or an array. That's
amazing. Yeah, to be honest, if that was possible in JavaScript, we probably wouldn't write TypeScript, just because that's what we use it for. I mean, there's for a lot of the apps we build, it's just object structure. Yeah. So if we had the ability to see that in JavaScript, that would be amazing. Yeah.
But I want to make it clear, it would give you, and currently does give you, some IntelliSense. But you can't get the actual type safety enforced by the compiler without using TypeScript.
Mm. Yeah. The developer experience with Vue and TypeScript is definitely improved greatly. It's from the Vue.extend and the Vuex kind of adding different typings. We're actually kind of cheating, and we're using KTSN's pull request in production right now. The one that improved the Vue typings and made them the Vuex typings and made them mimic the Vuex API. In contrast to one where we were using that other library, which is there's no shade intended for the other library. It's just it's much better to have it mimic the actual API. There's just less to learn. There's less stuff to break. It's much cleaner.
It's okay. I've done that before too, where there's a feature that I really, really want, and I temporarily point to the latest commit in the pull request rather than just the latest published version on npm.
Our DevOps guy was like, "Hey, did you mean to include Git?
Did you mean to do this?
GitHub.com/FABEF, whatever the hash is." I'm like, yeah, that was on purpose. He's like, "Oh, so that's not officially. Just keep it between us."
Yeah, living on the edge as long as you know.
Bleeding edge, not even released yet.
Yeah, not even pre-release, pre-merge.
Yeah, but as beta testers, we're super, super excited for this specific pull request.
Yeah, and if you've been finding it really useful, and you have battle tested it a little bit, I think it would be useful to drop a comment into the PR. Mm-hmm. And let them know what your experience has been.
Mm-hmm. For sure, yeah.
Yeah. Has there been anything else that you found with TypeScript that you haven't talked about yet that has improved your developer experience?
Oh man, with TypeScript in particular. So when I said we used it mostly for the data, the object structure, and that's about it. That is about it, to be honest. A lot of our TypeScript is using those interfaces to actually type the structure of objects. I work in a technology company within a bank, so our objects aren't the easiest to reason about. There will be kind of flags that you won't even know what the property is. It'll be just a bunch of gibberish. Mm-hmm. So being able to type out those interfaces with the keys, and then we use JS doc, TS doc, kind of the same idea, just to kind of comment exactly what happens. So the documentation for that specific key is in line with whenever you're using it. And that's the greatest benefit we found. Like I mentioned, we have like a really big team and we have some really big projects. So anything we can do to make it easier for someone, if they were to be just kind of dropped in a file, to be able to understand what's happening is a huge plus. And TypeScript offers that with basically like 5% of the features, which is what we're using.
Without having to go on a scavenger hunt.
Yeah. I've been through so many scavenger hunts that I try to avoid them as much as I can. So there's also this interesting thing. I'm not sure if anyone on the podcast right now has worked with props in TypeScript in Vue.
I read your article on it, your tutorial, your blog on it.
The complex interfaces. So there's a little bit. It's definitely not intuitive, but there's basically a way that you can specify complex props as object properties on a Vue component. So what happens is basically if you want to say this prop is this type in TypeScript, if you just do like prop type is complex interface, it's not going to know what to do because all the TypeScript interfaces are stripped out whenever it's compiled. So it's just type is nothing. It's a blank white line, which is going to break your app. But what you can actually do, and I wrote an article, you can Google front-end society using a TypeScript interface as types, as just Google front-end society, and it's the second article. But what you can actually do is you can make a fake constructor. And within that fake constructor, if it returns that interface, Vue and Vetter is going to be able to infer what that prop type is, if it's an object. So like the use cases, if you have a prop that's a complex object, you usually don't just want to say object. You want to say like this object of this structure. And we were able to do that by having that fake constructor. So that's also much. It's not intuitive, but it works, you know.
That's cool. I didn't know about that trick.
Yeah, I think that they are having there's an open pull request I saw that basically wraps that in a type. So you would just say, instead of writing that constructor yourself, you'll just say object as prop types, open curly brace, complex object, close curly brace. So there's work being done on that, because intuitively you would expect if you pass a prop type that's an object, you would be able to just say object as this prop type, you know? That's what we all thought, but TypeScript will throw an error. But if you do the fake constructor trick, it'll work smoothly.
See, that's why I'm worried about going full on TypeScript on my Vue projects, because I'm going to run into these little edge cases where for some reason my TypeScript doesn't compile, and I'm like, what do I got to do? And then I got to Google around and like, oh, Mitchell wrote an article about, now I know how to send this complex object through a prop, but I don't like that.
That's what it's kind of like. We speak like a special language when we work with Vue and TypeScript, because using a TypeScript interface or type as a prop type in Vue.js is just not English to other people, but like a lot of people are searching that exactly.
Yeah. But glad you're getting that information out there, helping people out.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. And by we, I mean, it's just me, but we're working on making sure that information is available to people that when I learned TypeScript in Vue, my only information was available in the form of kind of issues and pull requests. There wasn't any real source for that, like, here's what you got to do. So this is the goal with Front-End Society, is to be like, here's what you got to do if you want to do Vue and TypeScript. Hopefully in the future, all things front-end, but for now, just Vue and TypeScript.
Hey, Chris, where's the TypeScript Vue documentation?
Oh.
It's probably somewhere. I haven't written it. No, I think, I think Kitson. That's one of those things that you don't pronounce out loud very often. Some of the handles of people you work with. I think he might have written some, but it does exist. I think in Vue, I think with Vue class component, there's some TypeScript. No, actually, on our docs we have some TypeScript. We have something about TypeScript on our core docs.
There's like TypeScript support. Yeah.
Yeah, I did partially write some stuff, and I had some other people write some stuff, and I edited. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we do have some stuff. That's where it is. I just didn't remember. It's hard to remember what you've written.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, we do have it, and it's on the core docs. You can find it in the sidebar, and you can search for it.
Yeah, he's right. There's a TypeScript support. As of Vue 2.5, we've greatly improved the type declarations. And then there's a bunch of stuff about how to configure it with the compiler, the tooling. Yeah, this is really good.
I'll have to read it more.
And if you notice anything that can be improved, let us know. We're always open to pull requests.
Just a pull request away.
Change is just a pull request away.
I should get that t-shirt.
Get it tattooed on your finger. So if anyone is ever on the side.
No, I can never get it. I can never get it tattooed, because then what if I stop using GitHub and I'm using GitLab for everything, and they call a pull request a merge request, and then everyone's like, "Oh man, your tattoo is obviously really." You're still calling it pull request?
God, that's so GitHub era. Now we're talking about GitLab.
And actually, merge request does make more sense to me. Like, that's what it is. You're requesting to merge.
That's a good point. Like, what are I guess you're pulling the code into another piece of code, but it's a merge.
You're merging.
Yeah,
cool.
There's also. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna rave more about KTSN and the TypeScript work being done with the Vuex and TypeScript.
Oh, please do.
So there's this older article I wrote called "Writing Vuex Stores in TypeScript," and I actually think it's about time to update it, because it talks about using the Vuex TypeX library, which it's basically like it's the wrapper library that I was talking about earlier, where you wrap your JavaScript in a TypeScript package, and then from there you can import it in a TypeScript file, and you'll get type safety. And I'm just looking at the new API you have to learn, and just all of the additional stuff you have to introduce in your project, where it's much clearer to just say, it's much clearer and much more in line with how I think TypeScript should be treated, where the API for TypeScript and the API for JavaScript is the same exact thing. Just with TypeScript, you get type safety. It's much easier to reason about it that way. So super excited about that pull request.
Cool. Yeah, and if you do see something that does maybe need to be updated, you could also pull request there too.
Oh, I might. Yeah, I think I usually don't say this, but it's honestly perfect. I haven't had any issues whatsoever with it. I did see there was a little bit of discussion on the pull request over long-term impact of basically introducing it. Is it going to be a major release? Is it going to be minor? But from a developer perspective, everything works exactly as anticipated.
Awesome. That's great to hear. He does a lot of really fantastic work.
I'm going to have a tweet, an auto tweet every week, just please, you're doing great. More TypeScript stuff for Vue. You're awesome. Thank you.
I'm sure he'd appreciate that.
Just an auto bot.
Well, maybe, a thank you. It doesn't have to be automated or anything.
Yeah, but I write software, so it has to be automated.
You prefer to, or you just refuse to write a hen thank you note? Yeah, it's there has to be a better way to do this. You'll spend the entire day building some machine to put together the thank you note, just in case you might need to create another thank you note in the future.
Plus, what if we need to mail it? There's just a lot of open-ended questions we need to prepare for.
Okay. Well, I'm sure
requests.
I'm sure one tweet he'd appreciate.
Yeah, All right. I think I tweeted him. He's big. I'm a fan.
Awesome. Yeah. So is there anything else you've been geeked about lately with Vue?
With Vue, a lot of the work we've been doing with Vue is very complex internal applications that don't necessarily have a clearly defined a spec,
Mm-hmm.
And what I really, really am geeking out about Vue is just the ability really to, and this might just be how we structured it, not specifically Vue itself, but if we want to delete, a specific view from the screen, like we just swap it out with a separate thing. So with a lot of other frameworks we've looked into, there's a large amount of complexity with kind of the store implementation where you say only this component has access to the store. You say you can only it's Redux. Like, so with Redux, really, it's a lot to teach and it's a lot to learn. I find that a lot of the Vue setup is much easier to teach to someone who maybe isn't a traditional complete front-end developer, but rather a full-stack developer that might have worked in jQuery a little bit in the past. Or not that that's like a bad developer. It's just someone who isn't 100% dedicated to front-end, doesn't really care if he doesn't really care if your modules are explicit. He kind of just wants the table to show up on the page. So with Vue, what I've been geeking out really is from a design perspective, just how easy it is to teach, and I teach it a lot. Like I do like Vue meetups, I do Vue talks, and it's so simple, it's exactly what you want out of a framework, because it's not getting in the way. It's just a way to sync your data with your website or your data with your document, that's it.
Awesome. Glad to hear you've been enjoying the Vue.
I have some views on Vue and they're positive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think with,
you can make,
yeah,
whenever someone says it,
they can put that in post, right?
Yeah.
No, isn't they you?
They isn't me. I do not do any editing, thankfully. I've actually been playing around with editing audio lately, and it is hard. It's actually hard to make things sound good. It's hard to make us sound intelligent later.
Yeah, and I fully expect to sound intelligent later. Like, that's just non-negotiable.
Yeah, I assume that happens in post, so I don't have to sound intelligent now.
I was just hoping they would like mock over me with something that makes sense. So I'm actually curious if you guys have worked with kind of Vue native. So there's a library out there. I forgot the name of it, but we were actually looking into it for a native app, and I was wondering if anyone had any experience with that.
So a library called Vue native?
Oh no, a library for Vue native.
Oh, is it Weeks? No,
I think it's Weeks. It's okay. Weeks.
Yeah, there's currently Weeks, and then there's native script as well, which Jen Looper she's the developer advocate for Progress, and Progress works on it, and so she knows a lot about that. I think currently, because Jen has spoken about this extensively, and she's worked on Weeks and native script, and she's obviously has a native script bias because she works on that team. But I've worked on native script, not on Weeks, and like my interpretation, like I agree with hers, which is that the documentation for Weeks is not as good as native scripts at the moment. And I think the hope is that with native script becoming more popular, Weeks' documentation will also improve. But for now, especially with native apps, I find native script easier to work with and like reason about.
Yeah, and for people who like Ionic 4 is also essentially framework agnostic. So you can use Vue with it just as well as you can use anything else. And they even have an article and maybe even like a getting started guide on how to use Vue with Ionic 4. And I've also talked to people who have used things like Framework 7, which I've never worked with before. And they've built successful mobile apps with that. So really with Vue today, I feel like there are just a lot of good options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were just doing a native app project that I just adopted, and it was done in React Native. And that's kind of one area where I do see React kind of prevailing, just from the tooling perspective of native apps, where I'm assuming that's because they have a much larger team, but it's very seamless, to set up that React Native app. I'd be interested. Have you worked in NativeScript?
I have a little bit, but nothing that's made it to production.
Yeah, I've worked in NativeScript. Yeah, the same. I've not worked for it to go to production, but Jen Lupa has been she runs Vue Vixens, and at various conferences, she's been, I think the demo that she has people working on is building a NativeScript app using Vue. And so far, it's pretty much just creating single file components. So it's the same workflow as you would when you create a Vue application, except it ports over to native, which is pretty nice.
And what is NativeScript? So it's just JavaScript that compiles into native code?
I believe so. I feel like I'm very ill-equipped to answer this question.
So am I. I don't know.
Yeah, I you know what? I don't know if it transpiles the native code or it just like connects to native APIs, or I don't know. It does something and it makes the thing work, and then we're all happy.
And it has an app.
Isn't that the part? Isn't that the point of NativeScript, that I don't have to think about it?
Oh my gosh! Someone asked me how, because I was showing them the React Native app, and they're like, "How does that work?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Don't ask me
Write the
that."
code, and then it does the thing.
Yeah, there's people that do that for me. Like, just no. Yeah, so like a Vue Native would be very convenient, because there's in our team in particular, we're dealing a lot with kind of that learning curve right now with React, and we don't have a front end in React, so it's just our native app that's using React. Our goal is to start looking into writing native Vue code, so doing something like NativeScript or Weeks. Weeks was brought up and looked into, but I think at the time a lot of the documentation wasn't in English, so it's not something that we would be super confident in. But that's something I'm super excited for, a native Vue story.
Yeah, honestly though, like I don't feel like we even need it at this point. Like there are a lot of good options, and I haven't talked to someone who like wasn't able to build like a native application with Vue, and like for everyone that I've talked to who's used the tools that we mentioned, like they've been really happy with them. And so I don't think there's actually a pain point there.
And that was with Weeks, or that was with NativeScript?
With NativeScript and Ionic and Framework 7, I've known people who have built apps with all of those, and they've been really happy. But my personal recommendations to NativeScript, just because
Jen is great.
Just because I really like Jen. No, also because they have, if you like Vue, you probably appreciate good documentation. Mm-hmm. And NativeScript also has very good documentation.
I think Chris is telling you, Mitchell, that you're the problem.
It's me.
No, what I'm saying is like try it. Like try NativeScript, for example. Like try NativeScript and NativeScript Vue. And then we can have you back in the podcast, and we can talk about like what your experiences were.
That's actually what I'm trying to
say. If you still think we need a native, like a Vue native,
I'm just hinting at a future podcast topic. I'm not. I guess I just didn't know. So maybe like I honestly didn't know that it existed. When we did our initial research, it was React Native, full native, and Weeks. Weeks being the least likely we would pick, just because we didn't know that there was anything out there, so there's that is my fault. I definitely will look into this, though. It seems like a good software, and I hear Jen is awesome.
That she is.
I've heard that too.
She speaks multiple languages, so
she does.
Really?
Yes, she does.
And even though she doesn't speak Dutch, her Dutch is better than you'd think. No, she gave Dutch in a talk recently, and it actually, like, the first time I heard that talk, the Dutch really wasn't as atrocious as I was expecting it to be.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, if you, I believe that the talk that Chris is mentioning is up. It is from the latest VueConf US.
Yeah.
And I think it's on Vue Mastery. So if you go to Vue Mastery, they have all of the conference videos, and hers is up. And she walks through an implementation of a native app that she built in Vue. It's
and
really well done.
She also gave that talk at Spotlight Vue.js in Toronto. And I felt she had just come back from Amsterdam, Vue.js Amsterdam at that point, and I felt like her Dutch was better then than it was at VueConf. So if you want to see the best Dutch, that's the one to see. But if you want to see the most recent, more revised version of the talk, then you can see the VueConf one. It depends on what you're in it for.
Mm-hmm. What were some of your guys' highlights from the VueConf?
I got to meet Divya in person for the first time.
That is true.
It was a highlight for me.
That was good, yes. Also, I think in general, it was nice to be, and I think this is the same opinion that I got from the attendees as well, is that people really appreciated the opportunity to get to meet people who are working on Vue, because most of the core team was there. I don't think everyone was there, but a lot of them were. And so you could have, face-to-face conversations, and that's awesome, because that's much better than having conversations in GitHub issues, although those are still constructive.
I just like watching the videos because I couldn't make it. But it's great. It's all up in Vue Mastery.
Okay. So let's wrap up with some picks.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Divya, would you like to go first?
Sure. Since we talked about TypeScript, I would actually plug Daniel Rosenwasser's talk at VueConf, because he talked about using Vue with TypeScript. And I went back to watch it. My talk was right after his, so I didn't actually watch his talk, which I feel bad about. But I have watched it since, and it's really good. And he works on the TypeScript team at Microsoft, so he has full insight into everything TypeScript. And then my second pick, I only have two, so this is my second and last pick, is an article by Brad Frost. And he wrote specifically about his experience learning React. And this is not a diss at React at all, but this is more an insight into beginners learning a framework, because he talks about how the process of learning React was very difficult because the documentation was not written for beginner. Because a lot of the times when we create frameworks and we write documentation, we assume people know a lot of things. And so from a beginner perspective, that can be very difficult. And so he highlighted a lot of things from a super, super beginner, things like faults that documentation doesn't address specific to React. And so I think the lessons that he mentions can actually be ported over to Vue itself, so we can be more beginner friendly as a whole.
Yeah, I'll be reading that. Thank you. Okay, Erik, what are your picks?
Yeah, today my picks I have two of them. One is both Divya and Chris have participated in this organization. It's called Habitat for Humanity. I just happen to be on a trip right now for it. So it's a great nonprofit organization where their mission is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. So they like to, you can actually participate, help build houses for people that are in need. I'm actually in Romania right now. doing a build in Constanța, which is east of Bucharest. So it's a real great organization. Nothing to do with tech, but I just thought I'd mention that. And then I know a lot of people are looking, especially a lot of new developers, and if you're into Vue or React or Angular, are always looking for good places and projects to work on. And definitely there's amazing open source projects, but there's a lot of nonprofits out there that are looking for help for people who are looking to that are looking to work and trying to get some help. A great website is catchafire.org, catchafire.org. And you can see a ton of different nonprofits that are looking for web developers using all different sorts of technologies to help them improve their website, get advice, help them with SEO, or build them a website from scratch or do updates and upgrades. So I think those are my 2 picks for today.
Cool. Thank you, Erik. And Mitchell, what are your picks? It doesn't have to be 2. It can be less than 2 or more than 2.
Okay. So my picks, I tweeted this GitHub link to a package called Vue-prom. And what it basically is a promise wrapper component where you can tell this specific component how to handle the resolution of, there's a laugh, how to handle the resolution of a promise, basically. So you can say, like, when it's loading, show this. When it's completed, show this, and when there's an error, show this. So this kind of pattern, I actually might just not be very. I've never seen this being used, and I thought this was like such a good idea, and we've been actually doing it a lot because there's just a lot of cases where you're writing like dot is fail is true. You know, it happens all the time. And then there's another article by someone named Dylan Chanis, and he wrote about leveraging render props in Vue. So he is talking about basically how you can use Vue maybe a little bit similar to React, where you do use those render props and you do pass in things through like functions. And what I like about this article isn't really specifically that, oh, we should all just write functions in our render components as opposed to writing templates. But what I liked is that it really broke down what Vue was actually doing in the background, which is, I always send this to people when I'm teaching them Vue because I don't want them just to look at a template and say like, okay, now it works. I want them to know what the Vue template compiler is actually doing. So this was I would consider this good for like a mid-level Vue developer who's kind of always abstracted themselves away from what's actually happening. Now you can see what's actually happening. Love it.
Okay, and I do have to say, my friend Eduardo, aka Posfa, on the core team, also has a library like that called Vue Promised, and I think he did his first.
Yes.
Oh, is it just a ripoff? Oops.
No, it's not a ripoff. I think it's 2 people who like came up with the same idea independently.
It's a good idea though.
Yeah.
I think his complaint was that not a lot of people used his library.
Oh no. Okay, I take
so
it
I just
back.
want to give that a plug too. to Vue Promised, github.com/posva/Vue Promised. Vue hyphen.
What's it called? Vue Promised.
Yeah,
this guy must have a better
past tense
SEO strategy.
And he has tests. The other one might have tests too. I haven't looked at it.
I don't know. This one has emojis in the commits, so I'm probably going to use that one.
Yeah. Vue Prom, not trying to throw shade. Doesn't look like it has tests. Vue Promise does have tests if you're interested in more tested software.
Yeah, this is it's definitely a really clean pattern. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, cool. And then were those all your picks?
Yeah, that's my picks.
Cool. And then my picks are, the first one is Another Period, which is a show on Comedy Central. And it's basically like Real Housewives, but in like olden times or something. I don't know, Victorian era, whatever. You know, basically whenever Downton Abbey and stuff is supposed to be happening. That kind of thing. So it's basically Downton Abbey, except intentionally trying to be Real Housewives. And then we talked about Vue Vixen earlier, and I will mention that they recently started a Patreon. So if you'd like to support the work that they're doing to provide like resources and workshops and scholarships to people who I identify as foxy women, then you can go and check out the Vue Vixen Patreon. If you search for a Vue Vixen Patreon, you'll probably find it. And you can donate to help make their work happen. They do a lot of good stuff. And then my final pick is just outside. If you are in the Northern Hemisphere, it's probably beautiful out. It's probably really beautiful out right now. And I strongly recommend trying to go outside. You don't have to do sport or anything. You could just walk outside, sit down, and then continue coding. And it's beautiful. I think you'll like it.
What is this thing called?
Outside. Yeah.
Oh, I've never heard of it.
It's great. I've been getting really into it lately.
Is it a subscription?
It's not a subscription. Actually, it's free, but it only comes once a year, depending on where you are in the planet. Okay. Otherwise, there's outside, and then there's hell, just frozen hellscape. If you're in Michigan, we have 2 seasons.
Yeah, I was going to say, do not go outside if you're in Florida. Do not listen to him. It's way too hot. If you're in the Northeast, do it. If you're in Florida, stay inside. That's what you need to do.
Yeah. So those are my picks. And I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Views on Vue. And have a great week. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.